The letter was already in 3 pairs of hands before Adelaide Dalton even knew it existed. She stood in the doorway of the Millhaven Town Hall on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1882, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, watching as Randolph Crane passed the folded paper to Mayor Elias Bowen with a smile so satisfied it turned her stomach. The room was full. Every rancher, shopkeeper, widow, and farmhand in Millhaven County had crowded into those pine plank walls, and the low murmur of voices had dropped to a hush the moment Crane raised his hand and called for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of Millhaven," Crane said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who had spent years polishing his reputation like a silver watch, "I have come tonight with a matter of grave importance. A matter that concerns every one of you who has entrusted your land agreements, your water rights, and your livelihoods to a man you believed was honest." Adelaide felt the cold before she understood it. The way the words landed, not like an accusation, but like a sentence already handed down. "The man I speak of is David Sawyer." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in the low, dangerous rumble of a crowd that had already half decided something. Adelaide saw heads turn, saw faces she recognized, people who had broken bread at David's table, people whose fences David had mended without asking for payment, and she saw the doubt crawling across their expressions like shadow across a plain. Crane unfolded the letter himself, as if it were a sacred document, and handed it to Mayor Bowen to read aloud. But Adelaide had already moved. She was already walking forward, pushing past Hattie Morse and old Gerald Finch, her boots striking the floorboards with a purpose she had not planned and could not have stopped even if she had tried. Because she had seen that letter before. She had held it in her hands not 6 hours ago in the back room of the telegraph office, where it had arrived addressed to no one, or rather, addressed to everyone, and she had read every single word. She had wept over one sentence in particular, the cruelest one, the one designed with the specific genius of a man who knew exactly which blade to use. And then she had done something that had required every ounce of courage she had ever cultivated in her 26 years of living. She had gone to find the truth. Mayor Bowen, her voice was clear. It silenced the room in a way that Crane's theatrics had not. "Before you read a single word of that letter, I need you to hear something first." And that was the moment, that precise heartbeat in the spring of 1882, where everything that had been building for the past 4 months finally broke open like a storm that had been circling the horizon for too long. Adelaide Dalton had arrived in Millhaven, New Mexico Territory in the January of that same year, on a stage from Santa Fe that arrived 2 days late because a wheel had cracked outside of Albuquerque. She had not come as a mail-order bride, though several of the women on that stage had been traveling for exactly that purpose. She had come because her uncle, Frank Dalton, had left her a small piece of property in his, 3 acres on the eastern edge of town, with a house on it that needed more repair than the letter from his lawyer had suggested. She had come because Philadelphia had nothing left for her after her mother's death the previous autumn, and because she had spent enough of her 26 years being sensible and cautious and perfectly behaved, and she had decided that the West, whatever it was, could not possibly be more frightening than the grief she was already carrying. She arrived with a trunk, a carpet bag, a small savings that she kept in a leather purse sewn inside her petticoat, and a copy of a legal dictionary she had borrowed from the office where she had worked as a copyist for the last 3 years. She arrived with no husband, no brother, no father, and no apology for any of those absences. Millhaven was not a large town. It had the bones of ambition: a main street with a proper general store, a bank, a post office that doubled as the telegraph office, a small hotel with 6 rooms, a church, a school that was open 4 days a week, and a saloon that was open 7. It had a mayor who took himself seriously, and a sheriff named Dale Prout, who was reasonably honest and considerably more capable than he looked. It had a newspaper called the Millhaven Courier that came out twice a week and was read by virtually everyone because there was not much else to read. And it had, like most towns of its size and ambition in the territory in 1882, a complicated and ongoing dispute over water rights that had been simmering for going on 3 years. The dispute was the first thing the hotel proprietress, Mrs. Cora Webb, mentioned when Adelaide checked in on that cold January afternoon. "You will hear about the water before you hear about anything else," Cora said, setting a key on the counter with the authority of a woman who considered herself the town's primary information service. "Half the ranchers in the county want the creek. The railroad wants the creek. Randolph Crane wants everything. And David Sawyer is the only one standing between Crane and the rest of them, which makes him either the most principled man in the territory or the most stubborn one, depending on who you ask." Adelaide had asked which camp Cora herself fell into. Cora had smiled. "I make my own camp," Adelaide had liked her immediately. She met David Sawyer for the first time 3 days after her arrival, under circumstances that were neither romantic nor convenient. She had gone out to inspect her uncle's property in the early morning and found that the fence along the north edge had been torn down, not by weather but by hands, deliberate and recent. The posts had been pulled cleanly from the ground and stacked nearby with the kind of neatness that was almost an insult. While she was standing there in the January cold trying to decide whether to be angry or frightened or both, a horse came down the road at a measured pace, and the man on it pulled up when he saw her. He was not what she would have called handsome in the way that men who knew they were handsome tended to present themselves. He was tall in the saddle with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of outdoor work rather than any particular vanity. His face was angular and serious, with dark eyes that assessed the situation quickly and without drama, the fence, the stacked posts, her expression, before they came to rest on her with a question in them. "Your property?" he asked. "My property," she confirmed. He swung down from the horse without being asked, crouched beside the nearest post, examined the base of it, stood up and looked down the fence line. "Done recently." "Last night most likely. Ground's not frozen enough to have kept the marks longer than that." "I reached the same conclusion," she said. He glanced at her then, a second, more careful look as if he was recalibrating something. "You know fence work." "I know evidence," she said. "I was a copyist for a law firm for 3 years. I learned to read what marks on a page mean, and marks on the ground are not so different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "David Sawyer. I have the spread about 2 miles east of here. Sawyer Ranch. Adelaide Dalton. Frank Dalton was my uncle." Something shifted in his expression, not exactly grief, but a kind of careful acknowledgement. "Frank was a good man. I was sorry to hear he passed." "You knew him." "He helped me in a dispute over a boundary line 2 years ago. Never asked for anything in return." He paused. "I will help you get this fence back up if you want it." She had wanted to say she did not need the help. She had wanted to say she was perfectly capable of solving her own problems, which was true. But the fence posts were heavy and the ground was hard, and she had nowhere else to be that morning, and so she said, "I would appreciate that very much." They worked together for 3 hours. He was efficient without being showy about it, and he did not lecture her or explain things she had not asked about. When she made a suggestion about the angle of a post to better withstand the wind from the north, something she had read in a farming manual on the stage, he considered it for a moment and then said, "That's right," and adjusted accordingly without any fanfare. She found that more remarkable than she probably should have. By the time the fence was restored, her fingers were cold despite her gloves and her back ached pleasantly from honest work, and he had made a small fire in a ring of stones nearby because the temperature had dropped. They sat beside it for a little while, not out of any romantic impulse, but simply because the warmth was there, and neither of them was in a hurry. "Who would have torn it down?" she asked. "Could be a few people," he said carefully. "Your uncle's land sits on a path that someone wants clear access to. The creek runs within a 1/4 mile of your northern boundary." "The water dispute," she said. He looked at her. Cora Webb, she mentioned it within the first 10 minutes of my arrival. The ghost of a smile crossed his face, just briefly, there and gone. Cora mentions everything within the first 10 minutes. The water dispute has been going on since 1879. Randolph Crane owns the largest single tract of land in the county, about 12,000 acres southeast of town. He's been trying to acquire water access for 3 years, and he's not particular about the methods he uses. Is he the kind of man who tears down fences? He's the kind of man who pays other men to do it and makes sure there is nothing to connect him to the act, David said. He is also very charming, very well connected, and he has the ear of several men in Santa Fe who can make legal proceedings go in directions that logic alone would not suggest. And what is your role in all of this? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. My ranch controls the upper stretch of Red Cedar Creek. If I sell or lose that access, Crane effectively controls water for most of the smaller ranches in the county, about 11 families. Some of them have been here longer than Crane. Some of them have children growing up on that land. So you are holding out. I am holding out. She looked at him steadily. And has that cost you anything? He met her eyes. Everything short of the land itself, he said simply. She thought about that on the walk home. She thought about it a great deal. The weeks that followed were full of the ordinary business of frontier life. Adelaide set about repairing her uncle's house with the methodical energy she applied to all problems, hiring a carpenter named Pete Ruiz for the structural work, and handling everything else herself, learning the rhythms of a town that was small enough to have an opinion about everyone and large enough to have enough going on that the opinions were not all the same. She made friends with Cora Webb, with the schoolteacher Miriam Cole, and with the postmistress Alina Fitch, who was sharp-eyed and generous in equal measure. She opened a small account at the bank with her savings and began to look for work, eventually finding it as a part-time clerk at the land registry office, where her experience as a copyist made her immediately useful to the harried and perpetually disorganized registrar, Mr. Howell. She saw David Sawyer perhaps once a week, sometimes more. He came into town for supplies, for meetings, for the occasional evening at the hotel where the ranchers gathered to talk about prices and weather, and the ongoing negotiations with the railroad. He was not a man who sought company for its own sake. He was self-contained in a way that she recognized because she had it in herself. But he was never unfriendly when their paths crossed, and their paths crossed often enough that it began to feel like something other than coincidence. The first time she saw him in real trouble was in the 3rd week of February, when she came into the land registry office on a Monday morning and found the files for the water rights agreement in a state of confusion that did not match her own meticulous filing from the Friday before. Papers had been moved. One document, a certified copy of the original creek access agreement from 1876 that clearly named the Sawyer property as a designated water source for the surrounding ranches, was gone entirely. She stood in the office for a long time, looking at the empty space in the file where that document had been, and felt the particular cold certainty of someone who had spent 3 years in a law office and knew exactly what the absence of a document could do to a legal case. She did not tell Mr. Howell immediately. She told David Sawyer first. She found him at the blacksmith's on the east end of Main Street, where he was having a shoe replaced on a roan horse. She walked up and said quietly, "The original creek agreement is missing from the registry files, sometime since Friday afternoon." He went very still. The blacksmith, a large man named Amos who was not particularly interested in the politics of the county, continued his work with admirable focus. "Are you certain?" David asked. "I filed it myself on Thursday. I know exactly where it was and exactly what it looked like. It is not there." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, serious eyes. "Adelaide." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the directness of it, in the way it was not a pleasantry but simply a statement of acknowledgement, of the reality of what she had just risked by telling him this moved through her in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "I know," she said. "If someone finds out you told me, I know," she said again. "But someone moved that document for a reason, and the reason is you, and if you do not know about it, you cannot protect yourself. So, now you know." He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "I have copies." "Where?" "My ranch in a locked strongbox," she exhaled. "Good, that is very good. But a copy without the certified original is harder to argue in court," he said, "and we are heading toward court. Crane filed a petition last month to have the water rights reviewed. The hearing is in April." April was 8 weeks away. 8 weeks was not very long. "Then we need to find the original," she said. She was not sure when she had started thinking of it as we. She did not examine that too closely. What followed was the most quietly consequential investigation she had ever conducted, and she conducted it the only way she knew how, through the systematic examination of records, through careful questions asked of the right people in the right order, and through the cultivation of trust in a community that rewarded patience and punished pushiness. She learned, through Eleanor Fitch at the post office, that Randolph Crane had received a visitor from Santa Fe in the second week of February, a man named Tolliver who was described by 3 separate witnesses as carrying a leather satchel and looking like a lawyer. She learned, through Miriam Cole who boarded with a widow on the south side of town, that Crane had hosted a dinner party the week before the document disappeared, and that Mayor Bowen had been among the guests. She learned, through her own careful review of the registry office's visitor log, a log that Mr. Howell kept only intermittently, that someone had signed in on Saturday afternoon using initials that were smudged and illegible, which was convenient. She brought all of this to David on a Thursday evening in early March, sitting at his kitchen table at Sawyer Ranch for the first time. She had ridden out with the information because she did not want to discuss it in town where walls had ears, and because he had, without making a ceremony of it, begun to be the person she wanted to share these findings with. The ranch house was plain and well organized, with a cast iron stove and a good supply of firewood and bookshelves that she had not expected, 3 full shelves with law books and histories, and somewhat unexpectedly, a volume of Dickens and 2 of Mark Twain. She noticed the books. She did not say anything about them that night, but she thought about them. He listened to everything she said without interrupting, which was a quality she had come to deeply appreciate in a world full of men who interrupted. When she finished, he said, "You have been doing this for weeks without telling me. I was not certain enough to tell you before now. That is not Adelaide, this is dangerous. Crane is not a man who—" "I know what Crane is," she said, "and I know what you are facing. And I am in a better position to gather information than you are because he is watching you." "He is not watching me. He will be if you keep doing this." "Then we had better move quickly," she said. He looked at her across the table with an expression she could not fully read, something complicated and careful and not quite hidden, and said, "Why are you doing this?" She considered the question seriously because he had asked it seriously. "Because what is happening to you is unjust. Because the 11 families whose water rights depend on your land deserve better than what Crane is arranging for them. And because—" she paused. "Because Frank Dalton was my uncle and this was his community, and I would like to think I can be worthy of what he thought it was." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "Stay for supper." She stayed for supper. And then she stayed too long talking, and the conversation moved from the crisis at hand to other things, to the books on the shelf, which led to a discussion of Dickens that was lively and opinionated, and revealed that they disagreed strongly about the ending of Great Expectations, which somehow turned into a genuine argument that was more enjoyable than most conversations she'd had in years. And then it was late and he had insisted on riding back to town with her because the road was dark, and she had insisted she was perfectly capable, and he had pointed out that capability and caution were not mutually exclusive, which was a sufficiently reasonable thing to say that she had allowed it. They rode back to town side by side in the cold March dark, the stars absolute and enormous in the way that stars in the territory were enormous in a way Philadelphia's stars had never been. And when they reached the edge of town and she turned to thank him, he said quietly, "I want you to be careful." It was not a request. It was not a command. It was something in between that was more personal than either, and it landed in her chest in a place she had been trying to keep clear. "I will be careful," she said. "Adelaide. I will be careful, David." He held her gaze for a moment in the starlight. Then he said good night and turned his horse and rode back the way they had come, and she sat on her horse for a few seconds after he was gone, breathing the cold air and trying to be sensible. She was not entirely successful. The month of March was a season of parallel urgencies. There was the public urgency of the water rights hearing approaching and the legal maneuvering that surrounded it. And there was the private urgency of what was developing between David Sawyer and Adelaide Dalton, which neither of them had named, and both of them were aware of with the particular heightened attention of people who have been alone for a long time and are consequently very cautious about not being alone. He came to check on her property more than he needed to. She brought documents to the ranch more often than was strictly necessary. They had supper together twice more in March, and once he came to her house with a box of tools on a Saturday morning and repaired the kitchen window that had been letting in cold air since she arrived, and they worked around each other in the small kitchen with a careful awareness that was not awkward because they were both the kind of people who move through the world with intention, but that was charged with something unspoken that sat between them like the third person at the table. He told her in pieces about the dark past of the ranch, how his father had built it, and then drunk himself into an early grave, leaving David at 22 with the land and the debt, and 2 hired hands who could have left and chose not to. How he had spent 5 years pulling it into profitability through work that was not heroic in the way that stories made frontier work sound, but was grinding and relentless, and required the suspension of anything resembling personal life. How, when it was finally stable and good, he had started to think about what kind of future he wanted it to be part of. And that was when Crane had arrived and begun his campaign. She told him in pieces about Philadelphia, about her mother's long illness, and the 3 years of watching someone she loved disappear slowly, and the particular grief of being the only person left in a room after the last person who knew you as a child was gone. About the law firm and the work she had loved, and the ceiling that had been as real and as immovable as any physical structure, the awareness that her intelligence and her precision and her years of experience would take her to a certain point, and then stop because of a fact about herself that she could not change. About the decision to come west, which had seemed mad to everyone who knew her and had felt, from the first moment she sat on that stage out of Santa Fe, like the first genuinely right thing she had done in years. "Do you think you'll stay?" he asked her once in late March, sitting on the porch of his ranch house in the early evening when the light was going gold and the air was just warm enough. "I think Millhaven is the kind of place that gets into a person," she said, "if they let it. Are you letting it?" She looked at him. "I think so." He nodded slowly, looking out at the land, and she could see him deciding something, but he did not say it, whatever it was, not that evening. Randolph Crane was 44 years old in 1882, thick through the chest with the build of a man who had once done physical labor, and had since arranged things so that he no longer needed to. He had come to the territory in 1875 with capital from a cattle operation in Texas that he had sold at peak price, and he had spent the 7 years since then building himself into the most powerful single landholder in Millhaven County. He was not stupid. That was the important thing about Crane that Adelaide had understood from the beginning. He was not stupid, and he was not impulsive. Everything he did was planned. He began paying attention to Adelaide in early March, and she knew it immediately because she was paying attention to him. He was courteous in the manner of a man who knows that courtesy is a tool. He said good morning to her on Main Street with a broad smile. He told Mayor Bowen, within Adelaide's earshot, that Frank Dalton's niece was a credit to her uncle's memory. He sent a basket of supplies to her house through one of his ranch hands with a note that said it was a gesture of neighborly welcome that was several weeks late, for which he offered his apologies. She accepted the basket with a polite note of thanks and told David about it the next morning. "He is trying to determine whether you are an asset or a liability," David said. "And which does he think I am? Right now, probably neither. He does not know what you know." "Then we should keep it that way as long as possible," she said. What neither of them had anticipated was the speed with which Crane's assessment would change. In the first week of April, 12 days before the water rights hearing was scheduled, Adelaide came to work at the land registry office to find Mr. Howell deeply agitated, and a stranger in a black suit sitting in the office chair. The stranger, the Santa Fe lawyer named Tolliver, had a document, he said, that needed to be filed. It was a petition, supported by 3 notarized affidavits, asserting that the original water rights agreement of 1876 had never been validly executed, because one of the witnesses had not been a legal resident of the territory at the time of signing. The argument was thin, but it was not nothing. And if it created enough doubt in the judge's mind about the validity of the original agreement, combined with the fact that the certified copy was already missing from the registry files, it could be enough. Adelaide filed the document as required, because refusing to do so was not within her authority. But she read every word of it first, slowly and carefully, and she spent the rest of that day in the quiet back room of the office with the legal dictionary open on the desk beside her, working through the argument's weaknesses the way she used to work through a badly drafted contract systematically, without panic, looking for the threads that could be pulled. She found 3. She brought them to David that evening, along with a significant piece of intelligence she had arrived at through a combination of Tolliver's petition, a discrepancy in the county deed records she had noticed the week before, and a conversation with Eleanor Fitch about a piece of mail that had gone to the wrong address in February. "Crane filed a claim 2 months ago," she said. "Not through the county registry, through the federal land office in Santa Fe. He has been preparing this for longer than any of us knew. But the claim has a problem. He cited a survey from 1878 that placed the creek boundary in a different location than where it actually runs. The survey was commissioned by a land agent who worked for Crane. I believe it was deliberately inaccurate." David was very still. "Can you prove that?" "I can prove that the survey contradicts 3 other independent surveys filed in the same period. I can prove that the land agent who commissioned it received a payment from Crane in the same month. And I can prove—" She opened the leather satchel she had brought and placed a document on the table. "That this deed record, which Crane has been using to support his claim, contains an error in the legal description that makes it reference a parcel that does not match the actual boundaries of his land." He stared at the document. Then he looked at her. "Adelaide, how long have you been building this?" "Since the fence was pulled down," she said. The silence stretched between them. He reached across the table and for the first time covered her hand with his. Not in a romantic gesture exactly, or not only in a romantic gesture, but in the way of someone acknowledging something real and serious and shared. "You should not be the one to take this into court," he said. "If Crane finds out you have been the one building this case against him, I know. I have already thought about that." She turned her hand over under his, not pulling away. "There is a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named Briggs, who handled a federal land case 2 years ago. I have read his briefs. He is very good and he is honest. If you can send for him before the hearing, I will send a telegraph tonight." "There is something else," she said. "Tell me." "Crane is going to come after your character. It is what he does when the legal arguments are not enough. He has done it before. There is a man in Doña Ana County who lost his land not because Crane beat him in court, but because Crane convinced the community that he was dishonest. By the time the legal proceedings concluded, the man had lost his bank credit and his standing, and he could not mount a defense. David's jaw tightened. "I know about Doña Ana. Then you know what is coming." He was quiet. Then he said, "When? I don't know, but it will come before the hearing, not after. He needs to undermine your credibility before the judge arrives." He nodded slowly. His hand was still on hers. She was aware of it with a clarity that had nothing to do with the crisis they were discussing. "Adelaide," he said. "Yes." "When this is over," he stopped. "When this is over," she agreed, as if completing the thought was the same as speaking it. He held her gaze for a long moment with something in his eyes that she wanted very much to believe was what she thought it was. And then, because they were both cautious people, and because the crisis was real and present and the other thing could wait, he said, "I will write to Briggs tonight." The letter arrived in the 3rd week of April, 9 days before the scheduled hearing, and it arrived before Briggs did. It was addressed to no one and everyone. That was how Adelaide described it later, because it bore no clear recipient but had been distributed through the most effective postal system in any small town in the American West, which was gossip. Someone gave a copy to Hank Pryor at the saloon. Someone else put a copy on the counter at the general store. A third copy appeared pinned to the notice board outside the post office, which Eleanor Fitch removed within 20 minutes with visible fury, but not before at least a dozen people had read it. The letter was written with terrible skill. That was what made it so dangerous. It was not crude or obviously malicious. It was measured and seemingly pained, written in the voice of a concerned party who had wrestled with whether to come forward, and had ultimately decided that the truth was more important than personal comfort. It described David Sawyer as a man who had defrauded a business partner in Colorado in 1877, who had fled before the matter could be resolved in court, and who had acquired his property in Millhaven County through means that the letter darkly implied involved misrepresentation on the original deed. It cited specific dates. It named a specific business partner. It was the kind of letter that, even if every word was false, created exactly the atmosphere of doubt and suspicion that made legal and financial proceedings go sideways. Adelaide learned of it at 10 in the morning from Cora Webb, who was shaking with rage when she came to Adelaide's door. "It is everywhere," Cora said. "I have already heard 3 people discussing it at breakfast. Someone is saying they always had their doubts about David, which is a flat lie because I have never heard a word against that man in the 4 years he has been in this county. But once something is said—" "I know," Adelaide said. She was very calm in the way that she became very calm when she was most frightened. "I need to go to the telegraph office. To tell David. To verify something." She was already pulling on her coat. "I need to check the date cited in the letter against a public record. If what I think is true, then that letter contains a specific lie that can be proven." She was at the telegraph office within 5 minutes. Eleanor Fitch, bless her, had every record of correspondence that had passed through her office for the past 3 years organized with librarian precision. But what Adelaide needed was not from Millhaven. It was from Denver, and it was a matter of public record. She sent a telegraph to the Denver County Records office requesting confirmation of a single date. Then she went to David. He was already in town. She found him on Main Street outside the bank, where 3 men she recognized as ranchers were standing with him, and the conversation was clearly difficult. His face was composed. He had the kind of self-possession that came from years of being the person who could not afford to lose composure, but she could see the tightness around his jaw and eyes that told her he already knew. She waited until the other men had moved on, watching them leave with expressions that mixed sympathy with the carefully held neutrality of people who were not yet sure what to believe. She walked up to him. He looked at her. "I already know," he said before she could speak. "I know you know." "I have sent a telegraph to Denver." He frowned. "Why Denver? The letter claims you defrauded a man named Marcus Webb in Colorado in July of 1877. Says you entered into a cattle purchase agreement and then disappeared without delivering on your end." She held his gaze. "You were not in Colorado in July of 1877, were you?" Something shifted in his expression. No, I was in Tucson. My father was dying. I was with him for 3 weeks. Was there anyone who can confirm that? The doctor who attended my father. He is still in Tucson. And the church my father was buried at San Xavier. The burial record would have the date. That is what I need, she said. I need you to send a telegraph to Tucson immediately, to the church, and to the doctor if you remember his name, and request confirmation. Can you do that right now? Yes. He paused. Adelaide, you do not have to. I have already started, she said. Do not ask me to stop. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that she had come to know so well over the past months, and she saw something in them that went beyond gratitude, something that frightened her a little with its weight. Go to the telegraph office, she said more gently. I will meet you there. The responses came back within 3 hours, because Adelaide had sent her original telegraph with enough urgency and specificity to prompt quick action. The Denver County Record's office confirmed that no civil or criminal filing under the name Sawyer or against any person with that name had been entered in 1877. Not in July, not in any other month. The telegraph from Tucson came 40 minutes later. It was from Father Domings of San Xavier del Bac, who had been the attending priest at the burial of Robert Sawyer on July 19, 1877, and who confirmed that David Sawyer had been present for the burial and for the 2 weeks preceding it. Adelaide read both telegraphs in the small back room of the telegraph office with Eleanor Fitch looking over her shoulder and David Sawyer standing very quietly at the window. Marcus Webb, David said. I have never heard that name in my life. I know, Adelaide said. Crane invented him, or Crane invented the version of events. There may or may not be a real Marcus Webb somewhere. It does not matter. What matters is that the letter places you in Colorado in July of 1877 when you were provably in Tucson. She set the telegraphs down. This letter is a fabrication. Every specific claim in it that can be checked is false. The town meeting had already been called. That was the thing she had not anticipated, the speed of it. Mayor Bowen, operating under what she was quite certain was Crane's direction, had called a public meeting for that evening at 6 o'clock, ostensibly to discuss community concerns about the upcoming water rights hearing. But everyone in Millhaven understood what the meeting was actually for. It was to consolidate the damage done by the letter. It was to let the doubt harden into something official sounding before the hearing gave David a venue to fight back. She had 4 hours. She spent them doing something she had never done in her life. She went door to door. She went to Cora Webb first, because Cora was the town's most effective communicator and had already established herself as being squarely on the side of the truth in this matter. She showed Cora the telegraphs and explained what they meant. Then she went to the 4 rancher families whose water rights depended most directly on the Sawyer Creek access: the Hensley family, the Obregon family, Pete Ruiz and his wife, and old Gerald Finch. She showed each of them the telegraphs. She told each of them plainly that the letter was a fabrication, designed to destroy a man's reputation before a legal hearing that Randolph Crane could not win on the merits. She went to Sheriff Dale Prout, who listened to her with the methodical attention of a man who had seen enough frontier manipulation to recognize it, and asked 3 precise questions before saying, Miss Dalton, I cannot arrest a man for a letter, but I can attend that meeting tonight, and I can make sure it is conducted honestly. That is all I am asking, she said. She went to Miriam Cole and to Dr. Anders, who was the only physician in Millhaven and a man of considerable local credibility, and she showed them both the evidence. And then, with 2 hours left before the meeting, she went back to David. She found him at his ranch because he had ridden home in the middle of the afternoon, not to hide, she understood, but because he needed to be on his own ground. She tied her horse at the post and went up to the porch and knocked. He opened the door almost immediately, as if he had heard her coming. He looked, for the first time in all the months she had known him, as if he had been carrying something too heavy for too long. The self-possession was still there, but there was something beneath it, a tiredness that was not physical, and something older than the current crisis. The look of a man who had built something good from a difficult start and was watching someone try to take it apart and was not entirely sure he could stop it. She stepped inside without being invited because the invitation was in his expression, and she put her satchel on the table and began to take out the documents. "Sit down," she said. "Adelaide, sit down, David. I need you to hear everything before tonight." He sat. She laid the telegraphs out. She laid the deed discrepancy document. She laid the notes she had made on Tolliver's petition and its 3 weaknesses. She laid out the summary of everything she had gathered over the past months, organized, clear, numbered, the way she had always organized information in the law office, because clarity was the only weapon she had ever trusted completely. He listened without interrupting until she was finished. Then he was quiet for a long moment. "You are going to the meeting tonight," he said. It was not a question. "I am going to the meeting tonight. And you are going to read that letter in front of the whole town. I am going to read the letter, and then I am going to read the telegraphs, and then I am going to read the deed discrepancy, and then I am going to let Millhaven decide what kind of community it is," she said. He stood up slowly. He was very close to her, closer than he usually allowed himself to be, because he was careful with physical proximity in the way that careful people were, and she had noticed it and honored it. But he did not step back. "You understand," he said quietly, "that Crane will not forgive this. If you stand up in that room tonight and expose what he has done, I am aware of the consequences," she said. "He can make your life very difficult here. He has connections and resources, and he holds grudges. I know, your property, your position at the registry office. I know, David." He put his hand on her face gently, with the careful deliberateness of a man who did very few impulsive things and was doing one now, and she felt the warmth of it in the cold room and went very still. "You do not have to do this for me," he said. She looked up at him. "I am not doing it only for you," she said honestly. "I am doing it because it is true, and because this town deserves the truth, and because I cannot be the person who knows something unjust is happening and does nothing. But also," she paused, "also for you. Yes." Something in his expression broke open, just briefly, something that she thought might be the same feeling that had been sitting in her chest for months and that she had not yet had the language for, or rather had had the language for but had not yet found the right moment to use. "After tonight," he said, "when this is done." "Yes," she said, "after tonight." He stepped back because they were both sensible people and she was grateful for it, and also, she admitted to herself privately, a little disappointed. The town hall was full by 10 minutes to 6. Adelaide arrived with Cora Webb on one side and a leaner Fitch on the other, and she was carrying her satchel with the documents inside, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, which was where this story began. She had moved through the crowd to the front of the room. She had watched Crane pass the letter to Mayor Bowen. She had heard Crane's practiced, warm, poisonous voice calling for silence. And when she heard David's name spoken as a verdict rather than a name, she had stepped forward. "Mayor Bowen," she said, "before you read a single word of that letter, I need you to hear something first." Crane's expression did not change immediately. That was how good he was. The face stayed pleasant for 2 full seconds before it began to recalibrate. The mayor looked at her with the slightly panicked expression of a man who had not expected this variable. "Miss Dalton," the mayor said carefully, "this is a public meeting, and I am a member of this public," she said. "And I have information that is directly relevant to the matter at hand. I believe you are bound, as the mayor of this community, to hear it." Sheriff Dale Prout, from his position by the wall, said, "She's right, Elias, let her speak." Crane said pleasantly, "Of course. Let's hear what Miss Dalton has to say." The pleasantness was now a different kind of tool, the kind that suggests a man confident that whatever she says will not be enough. She opened her satchel. She took out the letter, her own copy, the one she had received that afternoon from a leaner, and she turned to face the room. She read the letter aloud in its entirety. She read it slowly and clearly, every fabricated accusation, every invented date, every false name. She heard the room breathing around her. She did not look at David. who was standing at the back of the room, because she needed to look at the faces of the people she was speaking to. When she finished reading the letter, she said, "This letter contains a specific claim. It says David Sawyer defrauded a man named Marcus Webb in Colorado in July of 1877. I have here a telegram from the Denver County Record's office, received this afternoon, confirming that no civil or criminal filing under any such name or incident exists in their records for 1877 or any surrounding year." She held up the telegram. She read it aloud. "I also have here," she continued, "a telegram from Father Domings of San Xavier del Bac in Tucson, received this afternoon, confirming that David Sawyer was present at the burial of his father, Robert Sawyer, on July 19, 1877. He was not in Colorado. He was in Tucson with his dying father." She read that telegram aloud as well. The room was completely silent. Not the dangerous rumbling silence from before, but a different kind, the silence of people absorbing something that changed the shape of what they had thought they understood. "This letter," Adelaide said, "is not a concerned citizen coming forward with difficult truths. This letter is a fabrication. It was created to destroy a man's reputation 9 days before a legal hearing that the man who created it cannot win honestly." She looked around the room. "I have additional evidence, evidence of a falsified survey, evidence of a missing certified document from this county's own registry office, and evidence of a federal land claim that contains deliberate inaccuracies. I will make all of it available to the judge who comes to hear the water rights case, and I will make it available to the sheriff, and I will make it available to anyone in this room who wants to look at it." She set everything on the table beside the mayor. "David Sawyer is an honest man," she said. "He has been an honest man in this county for 4 years, as many of you know firsthand. He is being attacked not because he has done anything wrong, but because he has refused to do something wrong, because he has refused to let the water that 11 families in this county depend on be controlled by a single private interest." She paused. "I think Millhaven is better than this letter. I hope I am right." The silence held for another moment. And then Cora Webb said from the crowd in the voice of a woman who has had enough, "She's right, and every one of us knows it." Gerald Finch, who was 73 years old and had been ranching in the county since before Crane arrived, said, "I have known David Sawyer for 4 years. I have never known that man to be dishonest." Maria Obregon, who had come with her husband and 3 of their children, said in clear and steady English, "Our water, our family's water. We stand with David Sawyer." The room moved. Not all at once, because rooms never moved all at once, but in the gradual and irreversible way of a tide that has found its direction, and Randolph Crane watched it happen with the face of a man who is recalculating and finding that the numbers no longer work in his favor. He tried once. He said smoothly, "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that Miss Dalton is," and Sheriff Prout stepped forward and said, in a voice designed to end conversations, "Mr. Crane, I think you should sit down." Crane sat down. The hearing took place 10 days later, with a federal judge named Harrington who had come down from Albuquerque. The lawyer Briggs had arrived 2 days before and spent those 2 days in the registry office and at the Sawyer Ranch, reviewing everything Adelaide had compiled. He was a thin, quick-moving man from Santa Fe who wore a good suit and had the eyes of someone who read legal documents the way other men read poker hands, and when he finished reviewing the evidence Adelaide had gathered, he looked at her across the table and said, "Miss Dalton, you should have been a lawyer." "I was a copyist," she said. "They are often the same thing," he said. The hearing lasted 2 days. Briggs presented the deed discrepancy, the falsified survey, the missing certified document, which Adelaide had by that point traced, through an examination of Crane's own land agent's records that Briggs had subpoenaed, to a locked drawer in Crane's Santa Fe lawyer Tolliver's office, where it was recovered by federal officials. He presented the telegraphs proving the fabrication of the letter's central claims. He presented 3 independent surveys confirming the true position of Red Cedar Creek and its relationship to the Sawyer property. Crane's lawyer argued vigorously for 2 days. Judge Harrington listened to everything with the patience of a man who had seen a great deal and was not easily impressed by either argument. On the second day, the judge ruled. The original water rights agreement of 1876 was valid. The Sawyer property's creek access rights were confirmed. The federal land claim filed by Crane's office was rejected in its entirety on the grounds of survey fraud. The missing certified document was ordered returned to the county registry. And the judge added, in the final paragraph of his written ruling, which was read aloud in the courtroom, and which Adelaide later had a copy of framed on her wall, that the fabrication of reputational documents to manipulate a legal proceeding was a matter he intended to refer to the federal attorney's office for further review. Crane left Millhaven within a month. Not in disgrace, exactly. Men like Crane rarely left in outright disgrace, because they had enough resources and connections to arrange a version of events that preserved some dignity. But he left, and he did not come back, and the 12,000 acres he had owned were sold eventually in parcels to several of the smaller ranching families in the county, which over the course of the next few years quietly and comprehensively changed the balance of power in Millhaven in ways that would take a separate story to fully describe. The evening after the judge's ruling, when the courthouse had emptied and Briggs had gone to the hotel to write letters, Adelaide sat on the steps of the courthouse in the warm April air and felt the particular exhaustion that came after months of sustained vigilance, not unpleasant, but deep. The kind of tired that told you something was over. David came and sat beside her on the steps. He had been inside with Briggs for the last half hour, and she had not waited for him but had come outside because she needed air, and she had thought he would probably come find her when he was ready. She had been right. He sat beside her and did not say anything for a little while. The evening was settling, the town sounds coming to her from a distance, and the air smelled like dust and something green and new. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. "Adelaide," he said. And then, because he was a man who, when he finally said things, said them plainly, without decoration or evasion, "I love you." She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because the words sat in the evening air and she wanted to hear them properly, to let them be real. "I know," she said, and then, "I love you too." He reached over and took her hand, which he had held once before at his kitchen table and which she had thought about since then more than was entirely rational. The hold was different now, not the careful, measured grasp of a man acknowledging a serious situation, but the simple, deliberate hold of a man who had decided something and intended to keep it. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "We were somewhat busy," she said. The ghost of a smile crossed his face, that brief, genuine smile she had been cataloging since January. "That is one way to describe it. Besides," she said, "I think we both knew. We were just being careful." "Are you still being careful?" he asked. She looked at him in the fading evening light, this angular, serious, unexpectedly bookish man who had helped her put up a fence on a cold January morning, and listened without interrupting, and ridden beside her in the dark to make sure she got home safe, and had stood at the back of a crowded room while she stood at the front, and she thought about what she wanted her life to look like, and how much of what she wanted was already sitting beside her on these courthouse steps. "No," she said, "not anymore." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, old-fashioned and deliberate and completely sincere, and she felt warmth move all the way through her. What followed was a courtship that the people of Millhaven observed with the fond attention of a community that had been through something difficult together and was ready for something good. It was not quick, because neither of them was quick about important things, and it was not showy, because neither of them was showy. But it was unmistakable. He came to town more often. She rode out to the ranch more often, and not with documents in her satchel. They were seen at church on Sundays, side by side in the third pew. They were seen at the hotel dining room on Saturday evenings with some frequency, And Cora Webb reported to Eleanor Fitch that the look on David Sawyer's face when Adelaide said something that amused him was, in Cora's considered opinion, the most hopeful thing she had seen in years. He showed her the ranch in all its aspects, not just the house but the land itself, walking her through the upper pastures and down to the creek in the early summer when the grass was at its greenest and the water ran clear and cold over flat stones. And she understood for the first time, physically and completely, what he had been protecting and why it was worth protecting. She sat beside Red Cedar Creek on a warm June afternoon with her boots off and her feet in the cold water and felt a contentment so specific and located that it almost frightened her, coming after so many years of being somewhere between where she was and where she wanted to be. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said. He was looking at her rather than the creek. She looked back at him with her heart very full and said, "Ask me." He blinked. "What?" "You have been working up to asking me something for 3 weeks," she said. "I can see it. You are not as unreadable as you think you are." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said immediately. You did not hesitate. "I have been waiting for 3 weeks," she said. "I was not going to hesitate." He laughed, a real, full laugh, not the ghost of a smile she was used to, but something unguarded and whole that she had not heard from him before, and that she decided instantly was her new favorite sound in the world. They were married in August of 1882 in the Millhaven Church, on a Saturday afternoon when the territory summer heat had broken just enough to make being dressed in good clothes bearable. The church was full. Cora Webb cried openly and without apology. Eleanor Fitch wore her good hat. Sheriff Prout, who was not a sentimental man, was seen to blink more than usual during the ceremony. The lawyer Briggs came back from Santa Fe for the occasion, because Adelaide had written to invite him, and he had written back that he would not miss it for anything. Father Rodriguez performed the ceremony with the warm efficiency of a priest who genuinely liked the people he was marrying. And when David said his vows, he said them with the same plain directness. He brought to everything, looking at Adelaide with a steadiness that she held onto like an anchor while she said hers. She wore a dress of pale blue that she had made herself over the course of several weeks, because she was capable, and because she wanted something that was hers in the way that felt important on a day like this one. She carried white wildflowers. She walked herself down the aisle because there was no father to walk her, and she did not need one. And she did it with the particular self-possessed grace of a woman who has learned that certain traditions are worth keeping and others are merely habits, and she could tell the difference. David, at the front of the church, watched her come toward him with an expression that she saw from 20 feet away and held in her memory for the rest of her life. The reception was held in the open air behind the hotel, because the hotel dining room was too small for everyone who came, and everyone came. There were tables from 3 different families and food enough for twice the crowd, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a guitar, and the music started before the sun went down and continued considerably after. David danced with her once, because dancing was not his natural element, but he did it with genuine effort and held her with a care that was better than grace, and she rested her head briefly on his shoulder in the lantern light while the music played and felt, with a completeness she had not previously believed was available to her, something she could only call arrived. They moved her things to the ranch in September. She kept the 3 acres her uncle had left her. She rented the house to a young schoolteacher named Alice, who had come to replace Miriam Cole when Miriam married and moved to Las Cruces. The arrangement suited everyone. Adelaide kept her position at the land registry office 2 days a week, because Mr. Howell needed her, and because she found she liked having work that was hers, and because the experience of the past spring had made her genuinely useful to the county in a way that she was not willing to simply set aside. The ranch in the autumn was different from the ranch in the spring. She learned it through the change of seasons, the way the light moved across the upper pasture in October, The cold mornings and the brilliant afternoons. The way the cottonwoods along the creek went gold and then dropped. The work of bringing the cattle to their winter ground. The quiet evenings with the fire going and the lamp lit and the books they both reached for at the same time on different evenings. And then, sometimes, read aloud to each other. She had learned by October that the Dickens argument was essentially irresolvable, and that they both knew it, and that the argument itself had become a form of affection. She had learned that he woke earlier than she did and always made the coffee, which was a fact she found entirely satisfying. She had learned that he hummed while he worked, barely audibly, just under his breath, and that he was not aware he was doing it, and that she chose not to tell him because she did not want it to stop. She had learned the names of all his horses, and which ones had complicated personalities, and which one, a gray mare named Patience, followed him around the yard like a dog, and occasionally put her head through the kitchen window if the morning coffee was taking too long. She had learned that he was quietly funny, in the way of people who are funny without performing it, and that the humor emerged most reliably when they were talking about books or law or the specific absurdities of county politics, and that it was directed at ideas and situations rather than people, which she respected enormously. She had learned that he held his grief about his father carefully, like something valuable and fragile, not hidden but not displayed, available when she asked about it and not demanded at other times, and that this was not coldness but its opposite, a depth of feeling managed by a person who had had to manage it alone for a long time and was gradually, carefully, learning not to. She had learned that he loved her in the way that some people loved, not loudly or dramatically, but constantly, in the specific texture of daily life, in the coffee in the morning and the way he listened, and the hand on her back when they walked, and the look across a room that said she was the thing in the room he was most aware of, always, even when he was looking at something else. She told him all of this one evening in November, when they were sitting by the fire and the wind was coming up from the south, and she had been thinking it long enough that she simply said it, because they had gotten to the place where she could. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then he said, "I did not know you had noticed all of that." "I notice everything," she said. "You know that about me." "I know that about you," he agreed. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the back of his hand. "Adelaide, yes, I am very glad you came to Millhaven." She turned to look at him. "I am very glad Frank left me those 3 acres," she said. He smiled, the real smile. "Write your uncle a letter. He is dead, David." "I know. Write him one anyway." She laughed, and he pulled her close with the ease of a man who had spent several months learning exactly how that worked, and she settled against him with her book and the fire and the wind outside, and thought that, whatever she had imagined her life might become when she had boarded that stage in Santa Fe in January, she had not imagined anything close to this, and that the fact that reality had exceeded her imagination was perhaps the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to her. The following spring, which was 1883, Adelaide told David she was expecting a child. She told him on a morning in April in the kitchen when he came in from the early chores and found her sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of coffee and an expression he could not immediately read. He sat down across from her. "You have something to tell me," he said. "I do," she said. She told him. She watched his face go through several things in quick succession, a kind of suspended stillness, then something that moved through him like light through water, then the expression that she thought might simply be called joy, full and unguarded, which she had seen from him a handful of times and always wanted more of. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands in his and said, "Adelaide." "Yes." "Are you well?" "I am very well." "Are you—" He stopped, tried again. "Are you happy?" She looked at him, this man who had been her opponent in a Dickens argument and her partner in a legal battle and her dance partner in the lantern light behind the hotel and the person who made her coffee every morning without being asked. And she said, "I am extraordinarily happy, David." He pressed his forehead briefly to their joined hands. She felt his shoulders expand on a deep breath, and then relax in a way she recognized as the letting go of something held. In December of 1883, their son was born. They named him Frank Robert Sawyer, Frank for her uncle, Robert for his father, and the naming of him was a quiet private ceremony that they performed together in the early morning light of the room that had become his, with no audience except each other, and the particular solemnity of people who understood what inheritance meant, and who intended to carry the best of what they had been given forward. Frank Robert Sawyer was a vigorous and opinionated infant from the first week of his life, which Adelaide found entirely characteristic, and David found bewildering in the tender and comprehensive way of a new father, which she also found characteristic. They both learned in the necessary and humbling way that all parents learn, which is by doing without sufficient information and finding that you are doing it adequately, and then better, and then, eventually, with something approaching fluency. Cora Webb came to see the baby and stayed for 2 hours and cried twice, which was on brand for Cora. Eleanor Fitch sent a handmade quilt of extraordinary quality that became Frank's most prized object for the next 3 years. Sheriff Prout came by the ranch, hat in hand, and asked to hold the baby, and when he held him he said, with the brevity that characterized all his important communications, "Good." And that was that. Adelaide returned to her 2 days a week at the registry office when Frank was 4 months old, bringing him with her on the days that Mrs. Hensley, the rancher's wife who had become a close friend, could not watch him, and Mr. Howell, who was a grandfather 6 times over and therefore entirely unbothered by the logistics of infants in small offices, made not a single objection. The Millhaven Courier, which had written a brief and somewhat sensational account of the town meeting and the water rights case in April of 1882, wrote a longer piece in the spring of 1883 looking back at the episode. The editor, a careful man named Porter who had been in Millhaven since the town was founded, wrote that the case had been a test of the community's character, and that the community had ultimately passed the test, though not without difficulty. He gave considerable credit in the piece to Adelaide Dalton Sawyer for her role in gathering and presenting the evidence that had turned the meeting and subsequently the hearing, and he wrote, in a sentence that she cut out and kept, that the courage required to stand up in a public room and read a truth that powerful men do not want read is not a common courage, and the county is fortunate to have people who possess it. David read the piece at the kitchen table and then looked across at her and said, simply, "He is right. It was a community effort," she said. "You were the one standing up there. You were the one at the back of the room," she said. "Which is where I needed you to be, not the front. We each did what we were supposed to do." He considered this. "Equal partners," he said. "Equal partners," she agreed. He raised his coffee cup. She raised hers. It was, she thought, perhaps the most accurate description of their marriage that had yet been articulated. They had a second child in 1886, a daughter they named Clara, who came into the world with a set of strong opinions and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, and who by the age of 3 was following David around the yard with the same devotion as the gray mare Patience, and who could be found most mornings in the ranch kitchen, conducting what she called very important business, with a toy set of scales and various items she had collected from the bookshelves, which Adelaide found both hilarious and concerning. Frank, at 3 years older, took his role as elder sibling with the seriousness of a firstborn who has been told it is important and believes it, and he and Clara argued with the specific fluency of siblings who like each other enormously and would never admit it, which Adelaide observed with the fond exasperation of someone who had been reading about this dynamic in novels for years and was now living it. The ranch grew steadily through the mid-1880s, not dramatically, not with the overreach that had characterized Crane's ambitions, but solidly, the way things grew when they were well tended and built on honest ground. David expanded the cattle operation in 1885 by purchasing a parcel of land to the north of the original property, one of the parcels that had come available after Crane's holdings were sold off. And Adelaide, with her knowledge of the county deed records and her relationship with the registry office, handled all the legal documentation herself, which saved them considerably in lawyers' fees, and also, she admitted privately, gave her a deep satisfaction. The water of Red Cedar Creek continued to flow through 11 ranches in Millhaven County. The Creek Access Agreement, its certified copy now properly secured in the county registry and additionally preserved in copies held by 3 separate parties, was never seriously challenged again. The smaller ranching families whose water rights had been protected grew and thrived and became, over the years, a community of interconnected prosperity that was frequently remarked upon by visitors to the county as evidence that the territory could work the way it was supposed to work, when people chose to defend it honestly. Adelaide and David sat together on the porch of Sawyer Ranch on a late September evening in 1887, 5 years after the town meeting, watching the light go over the land. Frank was 4.5 years old in Adelaide's arms. No, wait, Frank was 3 and Clara was 1. The children were inside with Cora Webb, who had come out for supper and stayed because Cora almost always stayed, and the air was the temperature of early autumn in the territory, which was perfect in the particular way of seasonal perfection that is perfect partly because it will not last. Frank Robert, now nearly 4, had spent the evening solemnly showing Cora Webb every horse in the barn by name, a tour that Cora had received with the appropriate gravity. Clara had fallen asleep against Cora's shoulder at the table, having previously eaten a remarkable quantity of cornbread and expressed strong views about the apple preserves. The evening was very quiet. The creek was audible from the porch barely but present, a thread of sound in the stillness. "David," she said, "Adelaide, I was thinking about something." "What were you thinking about?" She turned to look at him. In the 5 years she had known him, his face had become the most familiar landscape she inhabited, more familiar than any place she had ever lived, more known to her than the room she had grown up in, more hers in the particular and irreplaceable way that beloved things become yours not through ownership but through accumulated presence. "I was thinking," she said, "about that morning in January, with the fence." "The pulled fence posts," he said. "Yes." "And you came down the road on your horse and assessed the situation and started talking about the ground being frozen." "You had already assessed it yourself," he said. "I had. But then you assessed it too, and you were right about the same things I was right about." And I thought, she paused. "I thought, there is someone I could talk to." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the land in the evening light. "That is what you thought." "That was the beginning of what I thought," she said. "It grew from there." He reached over and found her hand in the near dark of the porch with the ease and certainty of a man who knows exactly where things are. "It grew considerably," he said. "Considerably," she agreed. "Are you glad?" he asked. The same question he had asked in the kitchen in April of 1883, with the same quality of real wanting to know, real openness to whatever the honest answer was. She looked at him across the porch in the September dusk, at the man who had come down a road on a horse and helped her put up a fence, and listened without interrupting and rode beside her in the dark, and stood at the back of the room when she stood at the front, and said "I love you" on courthouse steps, and danced with her in lantern light, and made coffee every morning, and hummed under his breath at the work, and held their son with bewildered tenderness, and raised Clara on horseback names, and argued about great expectations, and built his ranch from hard ground. An honest work, and had never, in all the time she had known him, been anything other than exactly what he was. "I am," she said, "the gladest I have ever been about anything in my life." He squeezed her hand. Inside the house, Clara laughed at something Cora said, a bright, ringing sound that came through the window and dissolved into the evening air, and Frank's voice followed it, earnest and explaining, the way Frank's voice always was. The creek ran at the edge of the property in the quiet dark. The stars were coming out over the territory, the enormous, absolute, uncountable stars of the New Mexico night. The same stars she had ridden under on a March evening 5 years ago, thinking about a man she was trying to be sensible about and failing. Adelaide Dalton Sawyer leaned against her husband's shoulder on the porch of Sawyer Ranch and let the evening be what it was, complete and good and entirely, irreversibly hers. In the years that followed, the story of the letter and the town meeting became one of those stories that a community tells about itself, not as legend exactly, but as a kind of touchstone, a reminder of what it had been capable of being when it had chosen to be that. People told it to their children. The children told it to their children. The version that persisted was simple. A woman had stood up in a room full of people and read the truth, and the truth had been enough. Adelaide herself, when she was asked about it in later years, and she was asked, because the territory was not a place where such things went unremarked, tended to say that the credit belonged to the community that had listened, and to the man who had given her something worth standing up for. David, when he was asked, said simply that Adelaide had done what needed to be done, and that the outcome had been the only possible outcome for anyone who had seen her read those documents in that room on that Tuesday evening in 1882. Because you did not argue with Adelaide when she had the truth in her hands, and everyone who had been there could confirm it. Their children grew up knowing the story as simply part of the fabric of who their parents were. And Frank Robert Sawyer, who grew up to study law in Santa Fe in the 1890s, told an interviewer once that his mother had been his first example of what a legal mind was capable of when it was combined with genuine courage, and that everything he had learned about the practice of law had begun with watching her stand in a room and read the truth without flinching. Clara, who married a rancher from the eastern part of the county and raised 5 children, and was known throughout the territory as a woman of formidable intelligence and warmth, said that the most important thing she had learned from her mother was that a community was made of the choices its members made when things were difficult, and that her mother had understood this better than anyone she had ever known. And in the autumn of their lives, when the century turned and the territory they had lived in all those years finally became a state, which would not come until 1912, but they were both still there to see it, David and Adelaide sat again on the porch of Sawyer Ranch, a little slower now, the land around them bearing 30 years of good work and shared intention, and the creek running where it had always run, clear and steady, because they had made sure it would. Still glad. He asked her, on that autumn porch in 1912. She turned to look at him. The face that was the most familiar landscape she had ever known, 30 years more known than it had been on courthouse steps in April of 1882. More, she said. He smiled. The real smile, the one she had been collecting since January of 1882 and had never once taken for granted. More, he agreed. The creek ran. The stars came out. The territory that had become a state held its ground around them, as land does when it has been honestly kept. And the story of Adelaide Dalton and David Sawyer, of the letter and the meeting and the truth that she had stood up to read, settled into the ground with everything else they had built together, permanent and real, the way true things are.